Welcome to the Path to Be Well podcast, a podcast about being well. I'm Doug Rawson. Join me, Mark Tremblay and Paul Glory, each week as we answer your questions with the sole purpose of helping people who suffer from a chronic medical condition in considering the safe use of cannabis so you can have a better quality of life. In this podcast episode, Mark and Paul bring awareness to sleep and include some best practices with your sleep hygiene, a review of some causes of poor sleep and strategies and alterations you can make to have a better, restful sleep. Consumers commonly look for the big sledgehammer effect when trying to gain a night of restful sleep, assessing your overall state of health and how stress, anxiety, or chronic pain may be a contributing factor to your sleep impairments. Dealing with these issues may result in you only needing a little nudge over the sledgehammer effect. Often, people are skeptical about the amount of information available online and medical cannabis and how it can relate to their needs. If you have a topic that you would like covered in a future podcast episode, please send us a text at 705-805-8264. If you'd like to be included in our community and be the first to receive updates about future podcast episodes, send us a text again to 705-805-8264 and with a message including pound podcast or the emoji microphone to update you with each new episode. Now, let's join in on the conversation.
Thank you for joining us. And today is our learning and knowledge session. So that means we have my colleague, Paul Glory, with me. Paul, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. And today we're going to piggyback off your week's discussion all about sleep. And this is certainly something that affects a lot of people throughout the population.
Yeah, Paul, you're right. There is a statistic, I believe, that you have found and provided that 1 in 4 people that you come across do suffer from some kind of sleep deprivation. And there's varying degrees, as we're going to talk about today. And some of them should not be ignored. They should be taken quite seriously. And I'm sure you'll dive into that. So if you've ever had a night where you've slept very little, and most people have at least once, you will know that the next day it's very difficult to fulfill your day the way you would have liked to. You know, brain fog, lack of alertness, and fatigue, obviously, and all of those things. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, Paul, but I just wanted to give our listeners a little bit of a preview of, what we're going to be talking about. So Paul, over to you.
So our manifesto today, interestingly enough, I guess a little ironic, there'll be brighter days ahead. Sun bright, sleep dark. I guess that's kind of why we chose it a little bit. But sleep is one of those things, as you've touched on, that can, if it's not right, it can have a profoundly negative effect on a lot of parts of your life. Not necessarily more than other conditions, but it is one that it's something you do every day and everyone does every day. And that's why really it can have a huge trickle down effect in a negative sense if it's not right. Be aware is where you would find the sleep stuff. And what we would say is I'm skeptical about the amount of information available online about medical cannabis and how it can relate to my needs. And today's discussion is going to tie into that a little bit. We will cover a little bit on cannabis, but I think it's important to discuss the sleep issues, at least in some degree. And more importantly, the things that you can do before you even start medicating. So before you even visit your doctor, and if it's looking like they're going to prescribe a sleeping pill or sleep assistance aid like that in some manner, or if you're already self-medicating with cannabis, there's a number of things that you can do. And I'm going to bring up a couple studies and really highlight things to that manner before you even medicate. At least give these a try and give them a serious try. I find we mention them, but they get mentioned in passing and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds good. And it kind of goes in this ear and a little bit out of the other ear. But we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail as the discussion goes on. We'll start with kind of some of the things where you've been during the week and in the be clear and be aware discussion. And I know you've brought up primary and secondary as far as sleep condition and where it fits. With primary conditions, I would say from a clinic sense, we see a lot less of this. There's the odd person that will come in with an insomnia issue. there's a few or a greater number of people I recall with issues of sleep-wake cycle. So this is your shift worker, that their normal circadian rhythm or their normal biological clock, it's sunny out, I should be awake, and it's dark out, I should be sleeping, is thrown totally off, and they're looking for cannabis to help treat that. And sleep apnea as being especially obstructive sleep apnea. So that's the more common one, obstructive sleep apnea, for those who aren't aware. It's usually due to your tongue, but it's something that's blocking airflow from getting in and then down to your lungs. And this is actually quite a serious and dangerous condition. And I know you have a story relating to cannabis treatment and sleep apnea regarding a patient specifically. Can you share that story with us, Mark?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Paul, because client stories really drive it home, because it's not just hearsay, something that we've picked up, online, or our thoughts. When it comes from a client, this client here came to us in really in a bad and sad situation. Like, nothing was going well at home, in relationships. Nothing was going well at work. He was really in a dark place and considering some dark things. But, when the doctor, rather than just prescribe 2 grams a day, which is what he was using barely just to cope with some sleep and cope during the day, the doctor was able to ask a lot of very valid questions and was able to narrow down to a high likelihood of sleep apnea and the obstructive type that you referred to, and suggested and actually consulted with the family doctor to say, you need to look at this like really quick. And this guy's really not in a good place. There's probably a high likelihood of sleep apnea and should probably see a specialist. So moving forward, this all happened actually in a very timely fashion. And then when this client came back to see us, he basically said, wow, what a difference. I've never felt or haven't felt like this. I can't remember ever feeling like this. Not that it didn't happen, but he couldn't relate to it because it had been so many years. And I'm a better person at home, better person at work. And you know what? I'm barely needing any cannabis at all. So this is a situation where this individual, without the proper diagnosis, could have continued and probably would have continued just sedating himself with THC to be able to cope, have some sleep and be able to cope during the day. But really the underlying issue and concern, as you addressed, would have been perhaps missed. So I'm sure you have more to add to that, Paul.
Yeah, I'll just close the loop on the sleep apnea part. So, if you're one that snores an awful lot, and it's the loud snoring that if the person that you're sleeping with, a spouse, let's say, is moving next room over but still hears you, that kind of volume of snoring, it might be a tip off. But the other thing is the person that if it's a spouse, let's say, that's there, if they recognize or see that there's periods of non-breathing, so this obstruction or this block, that's the dangerous issue, is this period of non-breathing, and they can go on for quite a long time. And so, where cannabis may be of some assistance down the road, the true treatment for this is to alleviate the block. And quite often, well, first off, what you would get is a sleep study, and they would watch all facets of your sleep. So they would, witness you not breathing 5 times a night, 22 times a night, however many times a night that is, which would be a huge red flag. But what would eventually be prescribed, if you will, is a device called a CPAP machine. And so it's continuous positive airway pressure. And it's a continuous flow that keeps that obstruction open so you don't go through the periods of non-breathing. And so, whereas cannabis might help you sleep, the symptom, and sometimes in large amounts, the true treatment or the fix to the problem is keeping your airway open. And that's why we say cannabis doesn't necessarily fit the mold for a treatment for every sleep condition. This is one. So that's kind of primary sleep issues, if you will. We'll touch on insomnia a little bit more in a moment, just to highlight methods of consumption when we get there. Quite often what we see in clinic setting at Weedwell is the patient who suffers from chronic pain that's there all the time, chronic anxiety, and a lot of other chronic from the autoimmune and neurological issues that just produce all the time, and usually it relates back to pain in these instances or some kind of discomfort, which leads to poor sleep. I can't get comfortable, I can't settle, I can't sleep. And so, really the sleep isn't the primary issue. The sleep becomes another symptom on top of the pain, the discomfort, the lack of mobility, and all that. And what we find there is treatment with cannabis, not necessarily directed at the sleep. But again, if you get a handle on the primary problem, even if a little bit, what we'll notice is even without medicating for the sleep, the person will come back 3 months later, 6 months later and say, I'm not perfect. I'm a little better, but I've noticed my sleep, I have gone from 2 to 3.5 hours. And even if we're talking in terms of, and you could see literature, 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep are needed a night. For the person going from 2 to 3 or 3.5, that can be huge for them. We talk about celebrating small wins. That's a small win. Just because if you look at it in terms of this, the person going from 2 to 3.5 hours has almost doubled their amount of sleep each night. And so when you look at it in that, it's a profound change, even though there's still a ways to go. And that's a small win, and that's something to celebrate. And it's amazing how those little small wins can work together, much the same as the getting beaten down and we'll say the losses really can have a profound effect negatively.
Yeah, Paul. So as a result of a primary condition, you're not sleeping well at night. And then when you don't sleep well at night, it really affects and can compound the primary condition, whether that be chronic pain or neurological, really any sort of ailment when we're not feeling well. So your body hasn't rested and our tolerance level is actually diminished because of the lack of sleep. It really affects that primary condition. So again, just so important to deal with the primary condition first and foremost. And then if there's requirements or needs for sleep, then we can deal with that afterwards.
Yeah, you can always add in if you try to do too many things at once, you end up getting lost, and it can be really defeating as well. And you're 100% right, where we just focus on the one thing first, and you can always, add in adjunct therapies or start attacking other symptoms as time goes on. But a good starting point is that primary condition. Regardless of where your sleep issues come from, and you've already touched a little bit on a couple of the big ones, Mark, you're going to find yourself having a hard time concentrating, having a hard time focusing. You might find yourself with issues of memory, and that can be shorter term or someone I told you just 5 minutes ago, and you find you're just missing those details that typically you would remember. Mood, definitely, and we've touched on this in terms of how it relates to your primary condition, but for myself, I'm not the most pleasant person to deal with when I don't feel rested. It can be more profound if it's 2 or 3 days in a row. And so we talk about mood changes and generally in the negative sense, you don't become a happier, sunnier disposition with a lack of sleep. So those are the, really big things and the most noticeable things. And I would say the person or persons around you are the ones that would notice that first, and they're the ones telling you're off today, or wow, you need to take it back a notch if it's a particularly bad mood or whatever. And you might not notice that, but if people are pointing this out, there might be validity to it. So those are some of the main symptoms when we're talking in lack of sleep.
Paul, as primary conditions, one that really stands out to me is someone that comes to see us. When they talk about their sleep issues, one of my first questions, and I believe yours as well, is tell me about your day. What's your day like? Because if someone is suffering from high anxiety and stress, even perhaps depression, even in their own home environment, and then you add work environments, and there's all kinds of things happening in the world today, the term that I've often used is, wow, look at where you're at with your stress level. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you would probably need what I refer to as a sledgehammer to be able to fall asleep. So, they chuckle about that, but I said, there's a point to be driven here. We need to really get under control your daytime issue. And in this case here, it's high anxiety, high stress. So rather than needing a sledgehammer, all you might need by nighttime, because you'll already be better poised or positioned for a good night's sleep, is maybe just a little nudge with a little bit of THC or even CBD alone to, just allow you to have and ensure a good night's sleep. So that's one that always stands out to me, because it seems to drive them in a area that it becomes difficult to control at nighttime if they don't do daytime therapy.
That's an excellent point, Mark. And I think we'll use that point because there's not much to add to it. It's really good. What are the things we can do in the evening? So you talked about, altering your day. Well, your day plays into your night plays into your day. And so that point is well taken. But let's talk about things that we can start doing in the evening and make we'll segue into little tips that you can do to help your sleep before you even start medicating. And so these exist in Weedwell.tips. So Weedwell.tips, in the Be Aware section, there is a sleep tips sheet and a sleep journal. And the sleep journal just plays off the sleep tips, as in you can document those 1 or 2 or 3 things that you attempt to do. And when I say attempt to do, it's not a do it tonight and I'm going to sleep 9 hours. Like, really give it a go, a week or 2 weeks to start noticing a difference. But these are the common ones that, if you've ever read about sleep or this or that, it's the ones you hear all the time. Shut off your electronics. Like, that really is a common message. And again, I think it's one of those that goes in one ear. Oh yeah, I do. And until you actually do, you don't realize how much you're on them. For a lot of people, keeping a sleep schedule. And so even on weekends, if you're a Monday to Friday person, don't let the Saturday and Sunday really change things up. Try to keep it the same, because as I talked about, in a negative sense, the shift worker throwing off that internal clock, that weekend can throw off that internal clock, even if you have a pretty good schedule Monday to Friday. It'll talk about napping in the afternoon and trying to avoid that. And if you have to, keep it to about 30 minutes or less, because we're trained, or we're supposed to sleep at night when our day is done. Exercise is being beneficial to sleep later on in the day is something you can incorporate into your day. And, I'll mention it again because I think it's a really good point. The things that happen in your day, whether it's the anxiety or the high stress, if you can get a control on them, medicating or not. So if it's something like where you're looking at using a little bit of CBD for that, or it can be yoga exercises, mind meditation type things, whatever you do to reduce that stress may set you up for a good night's sleep. So having said that, I've gone through the tips just like normal, and for those listening or watching or will listen later on, be like, yeah, I've heard that. I came across a study I want to share. And so personality and individual differences was the journal. And I was reading about it. It really spoke to me, so I'm going to share a part of my own life about it. And it talked about boredom insomnia. And it's not something, I got to be honest, it's not something that I was terribly familiar with. But as I got reading through, I was like, this is my life. It feels like right now. So what it was, the premise is being bored in the evening promotes bedtime procrastination. And so being bored in the evening, instinct or subconsciously, you push back your bedtime. And this doesn't matter so much if you have nothing to do the next day, but most of us, we can control the time we go to bed. We can't control the time we get up. We either have work obligations, the kids need to go to school, we need to get lunches ready, whatever the case may be. And so every time you shorten that window, it's going to result in a shorter sleep, and we're going to discuss a little bit more a poorer sleep. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. You got me hooked. I'll read more. So the premise was being bored, you become easily distracted. When you become easily distracted in the evening, it tends to be you go onto your phone and you're looking at Facebook or emails or whatever it is that you do, or you're watching TV. And then I was thinking, I've caught myself doing that. I will watch 2 or 3 episodes of, fill in your favorite show. And there's no reason for it other than when you look back, I'm actually bored. And people come by it honestly. The premise in this study was you have poor self-regulation. And I was like, no, I don't. You can't talk to me that way. And then they began to explain it. In this time of COVID, especially, you have kids that are at home, at least where we are, and you're trying to facilitate homeschooling with your own work and all the other obligations that go on in your life. And I'm not alone in this. There's lots of people. And what happens is you're so tuned in and turned on to being focused all day, you're spent by 8 o'clock. And so the poor self-regulation comes from you're just spent, you're done, you've thrown in the towel, and then where you don't have the self-regulation, the boredom kicks in and then you start getting on your phone. And so it was like, this is my life. You got me. And I couldn't believe it. And so inevitably, as I've noticed over time, as we've been locked down and at home, my 10 o'clock, 10:15 bedtime is now routinely 11:15, 11:30, and it's completely boredom. So it spoke to me. So as opposed to saying, as we've already touched on, shut down your electronics, well, here is an idea of exactly why. Now, here's the kicker. When you read into electronics and the exact hows and whys, and it appears the best that I can see is it's the light in the electronics suppressing melatonin levels. And melatonin naturally is produced to help you sleep. And so when you read, turn your electronics off 60 minutes or even more before you go to bed, well, they, as in scientists, didn't just make up a number. Like it comes back to something. And so you begin to see the story come together. You're bored, you grab your phone or turn on the TV, the easiest things that don't require anything. You can't stop yourself because of reasons I've just said. Bedtime becomes 11:30 now when it should be 10:30. And guess what? The kids still need to get up or they will be up at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. And so I've just shortened my sleep. I now have a poorer sleep from as I mentioned, the melatonin levels. And it's like, that's why I'm so beat. So that's a long-winded story. I just wanted to share that. I don't know if it's someone else's story and if it is, great. Now you kind of understand why. But these are the sleep tips that we're talking about. Again, they're at weedwell.tips. And there's the why to incorporate as opposed to you should. Here's an example why.
Well, Paul, it sounds like you had one or perhaps even more aha moments, even despite the resistance to admit that to yourself. Well, I had an aha moment while you were talking because I was under the impression, and maybe it's a combination of both, but when you are on your electronics at nighttime, that it's a stimulus, right? Because you're reading something that you enjoy reading and maybe some excitement as a result of that. And that would have, negative impact on your ability to go to sleep. But the aha moment for me was that the emissions coming off the electronic device is depriving you of melatonin. And that's really the contributing factor.
Yeah, that's, again, it was something I was less familiar with. So I'm just going by articles that I came across as it was, the one article that piggybacked to the next few that I was reading, very applicable to this. There is merits to your stimulating comment, though. What we see that, though, more so, not to group people together, but that's what I'm going to do, is in the teenage population with we'll say violent video games and very, very stimulating the stuff happening on the screen, the action and this and that. And so between the light and the activity that's happening on the screen, well, quite often teenagers have poor sleep. So there's definitely merits to what it is that you say. The result or the treatment for that, if you will, quite often you'll read, take a warm bath. We've talked before a little bit in complementary medicine about aromatherapy. Quite often you'll see lavender linked into having calming properties. And so this is why you'll see lavender quite often in bath balms and stuff like that. And it's all designed towards that kind of 60 minutes or so before you go to bed where the electronics go off, where you're trying to relax everything. So quite the opposite of what you're saying when you're looking at the email or looking at this or that, you're trying to settle everything down. And that's where you'll see in literature quite often 60 minutes as is your benchmark. So, if you set your bedtime, if it's 10:30, then you shouldn't see your phone or your TV after that.
Hi, Doug here from Weedwell. I wanted to hop in here for a moment as we're excited to share with you how we see our Facebook community grow every day. I want to extend a warm welcome to you in joining our community to get tips, tools, and resources while collaborating with others to support you on your health journey. Look for us at weedwell.group.
So, Paul, we hear a lot less about what I'm going to share with you these days. So I'm kind of giving away, my age here to some degree. But a couple of what might very well be just old wives' tales, as we refer to them as sometimes, is that every hour that you sleep before midnight is worth 2 hours after midnight. I don't know if there's any truth. My parents said that to us. I've said it to my children, and so be it. And then the other one is, and my dad, even is, he'll be 90 this month, still likes a glass of or a cup of warm milk before going to bed. And he claims that helps him to get there. So, Paul, I know you've not looked into this, but you may already have some knowledge that you want to share, and you will not insult me or embarrass me if you say that's all old wives' tales.
I won't speak to the merits of it, but you mentioned your dad, right? With the warm glass of milk. But that's part of his settling down routine. And so whether it's the milk or whatever the substance is, let's not get focused on that. That's part of his routine that he settled. So he may very well sleep well because he's had a fantastic routine over the years. The milk is just the substance, we'll say, for that. Can't speak to the other one at all. So before midnight or not. The key is, starting to implement these things. And there's actually watches and stuff now that monitor these things where you want to get to that REM sleep or that really restful sleep. I've seen it a couple around me, a couple people, they have these things they can actually show I was in stage 2 or wherever they were in their sleep and whether it relates to their restful or not. But it is a monitoring tool that you can implement if you have the ability to get one of those and actually monitor your sleep and see where you're at and then evaluate the changes. The tools are out there now. Having said all that, we'll at least introduce cannabis as a treatment. And sleep is interesting for that. When I first started at the clinic, it was very indica dominated, if you will. And as a result, you would see a lot of strains with fair amounts of THC, and that varied from person to person, but I need an indica for sleep. I need an indica for sleep. And that's the traditional, we'll say, classification of cannabis, sativas being thought-provoking and uplifting, and indicas, like used to say, in the ground, slow things down and shut things down. Over time, that's evolved, I've noticed in the clinic setting, to I'm looking for more THC. And even as time has further gone on, people will routinely use CBD twice or 3 times a day. That third dose will be at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. They're using it to sleep well as well. And so it's quite interesting, at least from the clinical setting, the evolution of, we'll say, the cannabis for sleep over time.
Yeah, for the longest time, Paul, it was felt that CBD could be mildly alerting, and that's why we didn't really recommend it at nighttime. And for some people, it might be. But as you said, for the most part, people who do take it at nighttime, it works well for them as well. And really, if you look back, if it's going to help with your high anxiety and stress during the day, that would tend to fit in well with nighttime and sleep as well. Now, Paul, you touched on indicas. In a moment, if you can kind of elaborate how, that is not so distinct anymore, indicas and sativas, because they've been blended and merged and all of that. But putting all that aside, I do recall a specific client that we had exhausted pretty much every option for sleeping. And when she came into the clinic, she says, I found what works for me. I'm like, oh, I'm anxious to hear about this. She says, sativa, a sativa strain helps me fall asleep. And I'm like, wow, that is something new to us, but thank you for sharing, and good that you found a solution. And that triggered an event that I've had many, many, many years ago. And I've shared this with you once before, Paul, maybe twice, but similar to even Gravol, where most people, Gravol will be somewhat sedative. And I've tried this once because I needed to go to sleep. And I tried, okay, I'll try Gravol. You know what? It was like an overdose of caffeine. Not literally, but I felt myself where I could be bouncing off the walls. So there's an example where, and we have found with the sativa indica, that there is a ratio or percentile of people out there that respond the opposite of what you might think. So I'm mentioning that so that our listeners and our viewers today could say, yeah, but you know what? I'm one of that, call it minority group. And they'll say, see, I'm not alone. So that's why I wanted to share that today, Paul.
Yeah, the indica, sativa, true classification, I would say, is long gone. It exists a little bit, but the way plants have been, we'll say, intermingled over the years, it becomes less of an important classification than, say, THC or CBD. And you're 100% right. There's been a few people that will say have come across my desk, and it's exactly that. And in the end, they've listened to their body. They've trialed a strain. They've, documented, even if it's not on paper, but at least in their mind, their reaction to the strain. So they've journaled their results one way or another. And they've said, this isn't right. This isn't working for me. And they've had to, clean the slate and start with a new one and do the same thing over. And for the individual that you bring up, that might have been 3 or 4 or 5 different things they tried, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality. But they got there by employing that method. So we'll continue this discussion just from creating your own treatment plan in relation to your sleep. And I said I would touch on insomnia for a moment previously, and here's where I'm going to tie it together. So insomnia, you can have onset insomnia or maintenance insomnia, as an example. And onset is I have difficulty falling asleep. Maintenance is I have difficulty staying asleep. And so people won't come in and say that to us in a clinical setting. We'll ask them, though, do you have problems falling asleep or staying asleep? And where this is geared towards is, and where you want to ask yourself this, is method of consumption. So we've talked about in the context of whether it's indica, sativa, CBD, THC, you're going to trial your way through what works for you. Hopefully you find the right strain the first time, but this podcast and many others have given you lots of information to how to try, assess, evaluate, and change if you need to. So I won't go there, but you'll be able to do that with the THC, CBD, however you want to pick your strain. Onset insomnia requires something fast acting or something slow acting that you take much earlier in the evening. So what do I mean by that? If you have difficulty falling asleep, you can inhale something, because inhalation has a fast onset of action shortly before you go to bed. And so this is, I picture the nighttime vaporizer sitting on the night table, and you would use that as needed, a couple puffs, and you might fall asleep. And this is a type of patient we've seen many a time. And for those that don't want to inhale, you can take a cannabis oil. I guess in theory, you could take an edible as well. However, if you have difficulty falling asleep, taking it right before you go to bed is going to be an issue because it takes much longer to start taking effect. And so this is where we would recommend people take it much earlier in the evening. Much the same as if you have difficulty falling asleep, you could, in theory, wake up, go to the bathroom. You could take another puff or two and fall back asleep if that works for you. But this is where an oil or an edible might work with the longer action to keep you asleep. You didn't have problems falling asleep, but staying asleep. That's an oil that you could take right before you go to bed. It's taking action long after you've fallen asleep because you don't have issues falling asleep, but it keeps you asleep later on into the early morning hours. And so, you want to ask yourself as you develop your own treatment plan, do I have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep or both? And that's where your method of consumption, how you're going to take into the cannabis, is going to play into your treatment plan. And so, I think we've shared a lot of information on how to develop or the things you need to be thinking about, once you've gone through the sleep hygiene tips and stuff like that, on how you would implement cannabis into your treatment plan.
Yeah, and definitely the sleep hygiene is the first place to start, and then really an assessment of what your sleep issues truly are. Just to kind of close the loop, Paul, on quick onset. So if you have difficulty falling asleep, then vaporizing, that's ideal. It could be on your night table. But if it's staying asleep, then an edible or an oil under your tongue sublingually is a good option for that. But there's also a hybrid of both. So a case where it's not so much falling asleep that's a problem for the individual, or a combination of both. But rather than wake up at 4 o'clock, even after sublingual dosing, 4 o'clock in the morning, they'd like to sleep in till 7. Another kind of way around that would be vaporizing just as you go to bed and take your oil at that point. So by the time your vaporizing dosing has worn off, then your oil kicks in a little later, an hour and a half or so later, to get you that extra hour and a half in the morning. So there's all kinds of techniques and varieties on how you can do this. And that's where, someone like ourselves that can really help a client, kind of go down that path. But for those listening, you now have that very practical tip, and feel free to employ that and even share it with others.
Yeah, it goes back to, picking one thing, starting with that. And as you get a handle on that, then start branching out. If you try to do too many things at once, you might get lucky and kind of have it all come together. But more often than not, you're going to find yourself frustrated. And, in this process right now, cannabis as a medicine, it costs money. It's not covered by the government or a health plan as a pharmaceutical might be, and it's a costly endeavor to find failure is all I would say. So we're just giving you little tidbits to, it won't eliminate failure, but reduce, big failures, if you will, reduce the likelihood of failure happening by taking little baby steps, figuring out one thing at a time.
So, Paul, anything to add, or are we at the stage of a wrap-up of a lot of what was covered today?
I think we're at wrap-up. It was a wholesome discussion today, and one that I quite enjoyed. So, sleep issues can be of primary nature, like an insomnia or sleep-wake cycle, like night shift work and stuff like that, or it can arise from a secondary condition like from pain. So it really doesn't matter where it comes from, just where your treatment is going to be focused, whether it's on the primary condition or the sleep itself. So in any event, you're going to find a lot of mental and mood changes as your sleep becomes poor for a long period of time, whether it's focus or concentration or just mood, your general demeanor, how you feel. And that's not going to lend itself to a very productive life. And so getting a handle on it is quite important. Over time, you want to start by implementing sleep strategies. We have some tips at weedwell.tips in the Be Aware category. And you can, there's an accompanying journal, if you will, and you can, check off what it is that you're implementing and really describe and journal how it is that it's helping or not. Those two tools, the journal and the sleep hygiene, is at weedwell.tips. And then you can start looking into different therapies. And so if cannabis is something that you're looking at, you want to start asking things about how you're sleeping, insofar as Am I going to sleep okay, but waking up in the middle of the night? Am I just poor falling asleep and staying asleep? And you want to develop a treatment plan based on that and evaluate, journal your results, and adjust as necessary is going to be your process going forward there.
Great. Thank you for that, Paul. To our listeners, the WeedWell tips that Paul has referred to on a couple of occasions here, for your convenience, I have included this in the post description section. So you'll find it in there, along with two other links that I've taken the liberty to put on there. One of them is to promote our new method of keeping in touch and getting regular updates. And that is with a secured platform of texting. So I'll leave that at that for now. And then as well, if you would like to receive and be connected with our ongoing podcasts, there's another tip there on how we can make that real easy for you. So it's a constant evolution, how we communicate, how you keep in touch and you keep informed. So have a look at that as well in the description section of the post. Paul, closing comments?
I will just say I look forward to our discussion next week. We'll talk all about sublingual dosing, the ins and outs of it as far as how it works in your body, the time it takes, different conditions that benefit most from that. And I'm sure it'll be another great discussion.
Very good, Paul. I'm looking forward to it. So now it's my turn to wrap up and provide some disclosures. So I'd like to remind our audience that these information sessions are intended for individuals who are generally in good health, are generally well-adjusted, are functioning effectively, and are not in need of medical treatment, and that includes treatment for health disorders. These information sessions do not involve the diagnosis or treatment of any medical or mental disorders and do not prevent, cure, or treat any mental disorders or medical disease. Further, these sessions are not a substitute for therapy, counseling, psychoanalysis, medical treatment, substance abuse treatment, or the advice or services of a medical professional. It is your responsibility to seek independent guidance from medical professionals to the extent that is necessary. So please do speak to your healthcare provider about the appropriateness of cannabis as a treatment option. And for those of you who have taken some steps in improving your quality of life, congratulations. We applaud you for that. And remember that your journey is your journey. And as long as you're taking some steps forward to improve the quality of your life, you should be proud of the progress that you're making. At WeedWell, we are committed to helping people improve their quality of life, and utilizing cannabis as a treatment option is one way to accomplish that. So in closing, on behalf of my colleagues, Doug and Paul, and myself, we look forward to the next time that you join us. And until then, be well.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Path to Be Well podcast, a podcast about being well. Make sure to visit our website at weedwell.com, where you can subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this week's show, we'd appreciate you sharing this podcast or leaving a comment or rating. We look forward to you joining us next time. Until then, be well.